What if the very first sign of dementia didn't come as confusion or memory loss at all? What if it showed up in a single moment, a strange sentence, a blank expression, or a passing comment, so small you barely noticed it? It's easy to brush off. Most people do. Even doctors, sometimes, miss it. Because the brain doesn't always scream for help. Sometimes, it whispers. And if you're not listening closely, you won't hear it. These early signs don't look dramatic. They don't demand your attention. But left unnoticed, they quietly grow into something that reshapes everything. In this video, we're going to walk through 9 subtle signs, early clues that something's not right. Some of these might surprise you. Some might hit close to home. But all of them matter. Brain and somewhere in the middle will uncover a sign that often appears years before a diagnosis, and yet, it's the one most families overlook. If you've ever felt unsure, or if someone you love seems off, don't go anywhere. Thumbs up and hey, if this feels important, give it a like, and consider subscribing to Senior Health Tips. Your support helps us keep bringing helpful content straight to you. Right arrow now, let's get into it. Here's the first early signal that often gets dismissed, but shouldn't be. 1. Why do I keep losing everything? A silent breakdown in mental anchoring. As we grow older, it's not unusual to misplace a set of keys or forget where we left our glasses. But when this becomes a pattern, daily confusion over items we just had in our hands, it signals something deeper. You may feel like the objects around you are playing tricks, constantly disappearing and reappearing. But the truth is, this isn't a memory problem in the traditional sense. It's a disruption in how the brain anchors daily experiences. This issue often begins subtly, as if small pieces of your routine are vanishing into thin air. The hippocampus, the brain's memory center, quietly starts to lose strength. Not only do you forget where you placed something, you forget that you moved it at all. And that gap? That missing link? It leaves a person feeling rattled, unsure, even betrayed by their own mind. When this pattern repeats, it no longer feels like simple forgetfulness. It feels like your life has potholes. Imagine walking on a sidewalk that looks solid, but with every few steps, a brick is missing. That's what's happening mentally. And it's exhausting. Speech balloon. I thought I was just distracted. I blamed everyone else. Until one day, I realized I didn't even remember picking up the keys in the first place. This experience is incredibly common in the early stages of cognitive decline. Most people rationalize it, brush it off, or feel embarrassed to mention it. But the longer we dismiss these moments, the longer we delay potential help. Counterclockwise arrows button real-life parallel. Imagine reading a novel, and every 5th page has been torn out. You can still follow the story, but important details are missing. That's early dementia. Not a total blackout, just constant flickers of loss. White heavy checkmark key insight. Repetitive, unexplained object loss isn't just aging. It's a subtle decay in your brain's ability to track reality. Light bulb tip. Create a simple habit tracking chart. Mark down what you lose, when, and how often. Patterns don't lie. Pushpin coming up. What if the world around you feels too fast, even when no one's in a rush? What you hear may not be what your brain understands. 2. Why is everyone talking so fast? The hidden collapse of auditory processing. Have you ever been in a room full of loved ones, hearing every word, yet understanding none of it? That moment when conversation feels like static on a radio, frantic, fuzzy, and far away. You might hear perfectly, but feel lost in the noise. For many older adults, that's one of the earliest signs that something more than hearing is being affected. This isn't about volume. This is about processing speed. How fast the brain can take what's being heard and make sense of it. In the early stages of cognitive decline, that internal translator starts lagging. People don't sound faster. Your brain just isn't decoding at the same speed. The result? You nod and smile while missing the conversation. You ask people to repeat themselves more often. And you quietly begin withdrawing from family dinners, social clubs, even church services. Not because you don't want to be there, but because your brain can't keep up. Headphone. It's like everyone became a speed talker overnight. But it wasn't them. It was me. I was lagging behind, like watching TV with the subtitles a few seconds late. This breakdown in auditory comprehension often gets mistaken for simple aging or poor hearing. But standard hearing tests won't catch it, because the ears are fine. It's the brain that's lagging. Brain neuroscientific note. Auditory processing is deeply tied to attention and memory. When the brain struggles to hold the thread of a sentence, it drops parts of it, leaving you confused and anxious. White heavy checkmark key insight. Feeling lost in normal conversation is a red flag. Don't assume it's just poor hearing. Light bulb tip. Avoid noisy environments when possible. Ask friends and family to speak a bit slower, not louder, and pause between thoughts. That space helps your brain breathe. Pushpin next. What if you're absolutely sure someone didn't tell you something, except they did? And not just once. What does that reveal? 3. You never told me that. Memory denial and emotional drift. Imagine you're sitting at the dinner table and your daughter gently reminds you about a family gathering next Sunday. You shake your head, confused, and say, "No one told me about that." But they did. In fact, they've mentioned it more than once. This isn't forgetfulness, it's a lost connection. In early dementia, the brain sometimes fails to store new information. That moment when someone tells you something, it might not stick. The memory trace doesn't even form. And because the person has no memory of the moment, they assume, deeply and sincerely, that it never happened. Speech balloon, I wasn't lying. I really thought they made it up. It's like the moment didn't exist for me. This denial creates emotional friction. The person with early dementia feels betrayed, while their loved ones feel ignored or even manipulated. The truth? No one's trying to be difficult. The brain simply didn't record the moment. This symptom often goes unrecognized. It's brushed off as stubbornness, passive-aggressiveness, or moodiness. But inside, the person feels lost. Imagine trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces never existed. Brain neurological insight. The hippocampus isn't just about long-term memory. It's responsible for encoding short-term events. When it weakens, daily experiences fail to get written into memory. White heavy checkmark key insight. Repeated denials of recent conversations or events are not defiance. They're blind spots. Light bulb tip. Rather than correcting, try using cues, photos, messages, calendar reminders. Gentle anchors help fill in the missing links. Pushpin next. What if someone starts using strange words, or insists they said something totally different? The breakdown may not be in speech, it could be in self-awareness. 4. That's not what I meant. The disintegration of language awareness. Words have power. But in early dementia, words can start slipping away like sand through your fingers. You say plate when you meant phone. You stop mid-sentence because the right word just disappears. Or you say something odd, and when your spouse corrects you, you bristle. That's not what I said. This isn't stubbornness. It's a glitch in the brain's language center. People begin to substitute words, jumble sentence order, or speak less fluently. But here's the hard part. They often don't realize it's happening. Speaking Ed, my husband kept telling me I was talking in circles. I thought he was just being rude, until I listened back to a recording. He was right. I wasn't making sense. This disconnect between perception and reality is deeply frustrating. The person believes they're communicating clearly, but the words aren't coming out the way they intend. It's like typing an email with a laggy keyboard. By the time you hit send, you've lost your train of thought. Book's clinical note. Language confusion is often one of the earliest cognitive symptoms. Before memory fails, language may falter, especially under stress or fatigue. White heavy checkmark key insight. If someone frequently mixes up words or insists they said something different, it may be an early sign of language breakdown, not just a bad day. Light bulb tip. Encourage writing things down. Writing accesses different parts of the brain and can provide clarity when speaking becomes difficult. Megaphone, comment below if you've ever noticed this in someone you love. And subscribe to support us bringing expert knowledge to more families. Pushpin up next. What if someone says, I think something's wrong with my brain even when tests say they're fine? That whisper could be the most honest moment of all. 5. I think something's wrong with my brain. The whisper before the storm. There's a moment, quiet, subtle, yet deeply unsettling, when someone says, I don't know what it is, but something's off. Maybe they're not forgetting things outright. Maybe they pass every doctor's test. But inside, they feel the shift. And they know. This feeling is called subjective cognitive decline. It means the person senses changes in their mental functioning, even before science can measure it. Think of it like a pilot who senses engine trouble before the warning lights flash. The intuition is real, and often it's right. Brain research insight. Studies show that people who report feeling mentally off are significantly more likely to develop measurable cognitive decline within 5 years, even if current tests show nothing. Speech balloon. I kept saying it over and over. Something's wrong. No one believed me. Years later, they did. This is why it's vital to listen, not just to symptoms, but to the person's instincts. Dismissing these feelings with, you're just stressed, or that's normal aging, is a missed opportunity for early intervention. White heavy checkmark key insight. When someone says they feel different, believe them. The brain often knows before the tests do. Light bulb tip. Get a cognitive baseline test, even if results are normal. Repeat it yearly to track changes over time. That's your mental health insurance. Megaphone, your brain matters. Your story matters. Share your thoughts below and subscribe. We're building a safe space for early awareness. Pushpin coming up. What if someone doesn't feel like themselves anymore? Not sad, just hollow. You may be witnessing something much deeper than mood. 6. I just don't feel like myself anymore. When personality begins to slip, there's a kind of quiet erosion that doesn't show up in tests. It's not about forgetting names or missing appointments. It's when someone says, I just don't feel like me. They feel flat, disconnected, as if their emotional volume knob has been turned down. This change is often mistaken for depression. But in some types of dementia, especially frontotemporal dementia, this emotional dullness is one of the earliest signs. The person isn't necessarily sad. They've just lost the spark that once made them. Candle. I used to love music. Now it's just noise. I used to laugh out loud. Now I just don't. Spouses and children may notice this before the person does. They say things like, he's just not the same, or she doesn't light up the room anymore. Open book neuro insight. The frontal lobe manages motivation, empathy, and personality. When it begins to deteriorate, emotional expression fades. White heavy checkmark key insight. A fading sense of self is more than sadness. It's a neurological shift. Light bulb tip. Pay attention to emotional withdrawal, especially if it appears without cause. Encourage expression through journaling, art, or even photo albums. Megaphone, if this resonates with you or someone close, let us know in the comments. And subscribe to keep learning how to protect what matters most, yourself. Pushpin next. What if change itself becomes frightening, even when it's just a new cereal box or moved chair? Routine isn't just comfort, it's safety. 7. Stop changing things. The collapse of cognitive flexibility. Have you ever noticed someone getting unusually upset over tiny changes? Maybe the living room furniture got rearranged, or the cereal brand on the shelf is new. Suddenly, what used to be no big deal becomes overwhelming and even distressing. This is more than resistance to change. It's about the brain's growing inability to adapt. In the early stages of dementia, the part of the brain responsible for cognitive flexibility, the skill that helps us handle new information, switch tasks, and adapt to change, starts to falter. Speech balloon. I used to love surprises. Now I just want things to stay exactly the same. At first, it might show up as frustration over small routine shifts. But over time, it becomes a rigid need for sameness, because anything unfamiliar feels like a threat. And that fear? It's not imagined. It's neurological. Brain clinical context. The prefrontal cortex plays a key role in how we process change. When it starts to decline, even positive changes can feel disorienting. This can make the person feel anxious, confused, or even angry. To loved ones, it might seem irrational. But to the brain in decline, routine equals safety. Wide heavy checkmark key insight. Fear of change can reflect neurological overwhelm, not just mood. Lightbulb tip. Stick to familiar environments and routines. Introduce change gradually with reassurance. Avoid making multiple changes at once. Megaphone, have you seen this in your family? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe to help us reach more people who need support. Pushpin next up. What happens when the world begins to feel hostile? When a once-loving parent suddenly believes everyone's out to get them. The fear is real, and it runs deep. 8. Everyone's against me. The rise of suspicion and paranoia. Paranoia is one of the most heart-wrenching changes in early dementia. It doesn't always start big. It might begin with someone thinking their wallet is being moved or the neighbors are watching them. But soon, these thoughts grow darker. Speech balloon, they're taking things from me. I know it. Even my daughter is hiding stuff. These beliefs aren't grounded in reality, but they feel real to the person experiencing them. As dementia affects the brain's ability to interpret social cues and context, harmless situations begin to feel threatening. Even loved ones may be seen as part of a plot. This breakdown in trust doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from fear. The brain, trying to make sense of missing or confused details, fills in the blanks with imagined betrayals. Bar chart medical perspective. Lewy body dementia, in particular, often begins with delusions and hallucinations before memory loss becomes obvious. This can be deeply painful for families. Being accused of stealing, lying, or conspiring is devastating, especially when you're trying your best to care. White heavy checkmark key insight. Sudden suspicion may signal early neurological misinterpretation, not personality change. Lightbulb tip. Don't argue with delusions. Gently redirect and reassure. If paranoia persists, consult a neurologist. Some medications can help. Megaphone, if this feels familiar, you're not alone. Share your story below and hit subscribe. It helps others find comfort in shared experience. Pushpin next. When anger replaces affection and the calmest person you knew begins snapping constantly. What's happening isn't cruelty. It's a cry for help. 9. You're the one messing things up. When blame masks fear. The final, often misunderstood sign? Sudden irritability, defensiveness, and blame. The person you knew as calm and thoughtful begins to lash out. Every mistake becomes someone else's fault. Speech balloon. You moved my pills. You said the wrong time. You're trying to confuse me. It's heartbreaking. And it feels personal. But this anger often masks something deeper, fear. As the mind becomes less reliable, people cling to control. When things don't make sense, they blame others, not out of malice, but as a defense mechanism. Brain psychological insight. This kind of emotional reaction isn't about hostility, it's an instinctive attempt to protect the self from the terror of mental decline. When memory falters and confusion creeps in, blaming someone else is easier than admitting I don't know. The brain reaches for certainty, even if it means turning on loved ones. White heavy checkmark key insight. Anger and blame may be fear in disguise, not true resentment. Lightbulb tip. Stay calm. Avoid reacting emotionally. Offer calm clarity, not correction. Megaphone, has this happened to you or someone you love? Share your experience, and don't forget to subscribe. You never know who your story might help. Pushpin final reflection. Dementia doesn't always announce itself with memory loss. Sometimes, it speaks through emotion, suspicion, or silence. But if you know how to listen, you'll hear it. Conclusion. The first signs aren't loud, they're whispered. Dementia rarely kicks down the door. It taps. It whispers. It hides in frustration, confusion, and words that don't quite fit. And because those whispers are so easy to miss, many families only realize the truth when it's too late to plan. But now, you know what to listen for. You've heard the strange phrases, the emotional shifts, the subtle clues that something deeper might be going on. And if any of them ring true for someone you care about, don't wait. Talk to your doctor. Get testing. Track the changes. Early awareness doesn't just change the course of illness, it changes lives. It allows you to prepare, to support, to preserve dignity and connection. White heavy checkmark key lessons to remember. Don't brush off subtle changes, document them. Believe your instincts, even when tests say normal. Emotional shifts often come before memory loss. Stay attuned. Stay calm, patient, and compassionate when conflict arises. Routine, gentle reassurance, and respectful communication go a long way. These signs aren't about memory alone. They're about identity, trust, connection, and noticing when someone is slowly slipping away, even if they seem fine. So listen to the whispers. Respond with kindness. And remember, early action is the most powerful tool we have. Brain call to action. Subscribe to Senior Health Tips for expert guidance, caregiver tools, and heartfelt insight into how we can age with dignity, strength, and support. Megaphone, if this video helped you, please give it a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and share it with someone who might need it. Together, we can spread awareness and empower more families to face dementia with clarity and compassion. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself and each other. Senior Health Tips Team.